Welcome to Headline Wednesday from Dispatch, U.S. Military History Magazine, developed by trackpads.com. Each week, we take one pivotal moment from United States military history and follow it from the first warning signs to the final outcome. Today, we go to the Caribbean island of Grenada in the late Cold War era for the story of Operation Urgent Fury. A longer version of this feature, with fact sheets and photos, is available in the print edition, on LinkedIn, or by email. The night over Grenada in late October 1983 was thick and humid, the kind of coastal darkness where runway lights and muzzle flashes could appear without warning. Far out over the water, C-130 transports droned toward Point Salines, the new airfield jutting from the island's southern tip. Inside, United States Army Rangers checked parachute harnesses by feel and shouted over the engines, running through a plan that had changed more than once on the way in. Maps were thin, radio frequencies were still being sorted out, and the exact locations of American medical students across the island were not fully clear. It felt rushed because it was. Below them, students at St. George's University tried to make sense of rumors, roadblocks, and fragments of news. Some had heard about a Marxist coup and arrests in the streets. Others only knew that airport lights burned late and unfamiliar patrols moved along roads that had felt ordinary only days earlier. Grenada was small on a map, but for Americans waiting in dorm rooms and classrooms, it suddenly felt very far from home. As aircraft noise rolled over the shoreline, some imagined an evacuation, some feared a firefight, and none knew how close combat would come. Point Salines was the key to the whole operation. If Rangers could seize and open the runway, heavier forces, supplies, and evacuation flights could follow. Yet the airfield still held construction equipment and obstacles, and the plan now called for a parachute assault rather than a simple landing. In the final minutes before the jump, confusion mixed with training. Some aircraft struggled with timing and navigation, and communications between units were not as clean as planning charts implied. Still, when the green light came on, Rangers stepped into the darkness, trusting their gear, their rehearsals, and each other. Their task was simple in concept and hard in practice: seize the airfield, find the students, and turn chaos into order. From a distance, Grenada was a Caribbean island better known for nutmeg than warfare. But in October 1983, it sat at the intersection of Cold War anxiety, regional instability, and the fresh memory of the bombing that had killed American troops in Beirut. A Marxist faction had overthrown and executed Prime Minister Maurice Bishop, declared curfews, and thrown up roadblocks. Cuban military engineers and advisors were working on the Point Salines airfield, feeding Washington's concern that the island could become another foothold for Soviet influence in the hemisphere. For the United States, the stakes went beyond ideology. Hundreds of American medical students were scattered across Grenada, unarmed and vulnerable if the new regime decided to use them as leverage. The memory of the Iran hostage crisis still shaped American politics, and no one wanted another prolonged hostage drama. The recent violence in Beirut added to the sense that Americans overseas could become targets before Washington had time to react. Regional credibility also mattered. Caribbean governments worried that the coup might incur imitators or invite outside meddling if it went unanswered, and several nearby states supported action. American commanders also understood that the operation would test whether the services could work together under pressure after years of criticism about joint coordination. The crisis moved from troubling to urgent in days, leaving little time to build a polished plan. That compression mattered because Grenada was not a large battlefield, but it was a complicated one. The island had several airfields, ports, ridges, campuses, and political targets, separated by narrow roads and steep ground. A mistake in one place could delay aircraft in another, leave students unaccounted for, or strand a small team under fire while the rest of the force struggled to understand what was happening.
A joint force had to be assembled from Rangers, Marines, airborne infantry, special operations forces, naval power offshore, and Caribbean contingents. Each brought strengths, but also separate radios, procedures, maps, and habits. Some officers relied on tourist maps and hand-marked sketches. Air crews and ground commanders had to align call signs, frequencies, and fire support procedures in hours rather than weeks. The objectives sounded clear on paper, but the glue that makes a joint force work was being mixed while the force was already moving.
Rangers were assigned to seize Point Salines and open it for follow-on forces. Marines would land in the northeast, secure Pearl's airfield, and push through nearby towns. Special operations teams would try to secure the Governor General, radio facilities, and other sensitive locations. The 82nd Airborne Division stood ready to flow into Point Salines once the runway could receive larger transports. Somewhere inside that patchwork were the medical students, divided among multiple campuses. Not every unit had correctly plotted. With ships underway and aircraft launching, the gaps would have to be handled on the ground. That meant junior leaders would carry much of the burden. They would have to identify roads, make contact with frightened civilians, sort rumor from fact, and keep moving even when the larger picture was unclear. The mission was planned as a rescue and stabilization operation, but once troops landed, every objective became a tactical problem with real enemy fire attached to it.
When the first Rangers landed at Point Salines, the rushed planning became real beneath their boots. Small arms and anti-aircraft fire probed the incoming aircraft and descending parachutes. Once on the ground, Rangers fought from berms, half-finished buildings, and ditches cut for future taxiways while clearing obstacles from the runway. Every section of pavement opened meant more room for transports and reinforcements. Progress came through men dragging barriers aside, pushing defensive lines outward, and turning an unfinished airfield into a working combat hub under fire.
Beyond the perimeter lay the first human objective of the operation, the students at True Blue and other campuses. Patrols moved along roads that did not always match the maps, passing houses, fields, and checkpoints marked only in pencil, if at all. Some convoys took fire from positions overlooking junctions, while others advanced through areas where defenders had slipped away. When Rangers reached groups of students, the relief was immediate. But it was also clear that not every campus had been accounted for, and evacuation would take time. Radios filled with requests for helicopters, trucks, and better directions. Far to the north, Marines came ashore near Pearl's airfield. Resistance was lighter than some had feared, but they still faced anti-aircraft guns, bunkers, and the problem of sorting civilians from combatants in villages that had awakened to foreign troops on their beaches. Marine infantry and armored vehicles moved along narrow roads and ridges, securing the airstrip and pushing toward towns in the island's northern defensive network. Helicopters carried reconnaissance teams and gave commanders eyes on terrain ground units could not yet see. Special operations teams faced some of the hardest early tests. Navy special warfare operators dealt with rough seas, poor visibility, and enemy fire. One mission to secure the Governor General's residence became a prolonged fight as Grenadian forces fired from surrounding high ground. The team on the ground used cover, discipline, and repeated calls for support. But mismatched radios and command chains stretched over sea, air, and land made those calls slower than anyone wanted. The fight showed exactly what happens when courage arrives before the communications plan is fully ready. As the first day became the second, paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division arrived at Point Salines, adding strength but also complexity. Columns pushed inland toward the capital and other student locations through checkpoints, possible ambush sites, and place names that did not always match what soldiers saw. Firefights broke out near barracks, road junctions, and fortified positions on ridges. Cuban personnel at construction camps and Grenadian units at forts and barracks did not simply disappear. At Fort Frederick and other commanding heights, defenders used mortars, machine guns, and direct fire to harass American movements. American commanders relied on naval gunfire, close air support, and gunships to silence strongpoints. But every fire mission depended on accurate spotting, clear communications, and maps that matched the terrain. Where those elements lined up, defenders were forced to retreat or surrender. Where they did not, units traded fire longer than planned. Later helicopter assaults near the capital showed both the daring of the troops and the limits of the rushed plan. Aircraft flew low over ridges and water, threading through known and suspected gun positions. By then, smoke, misdirected fire, and overlapping objectives made clear that Grenada would not be a neat sequence of checkmarks. What turned the fight was not a flawless plan, but small unit leadership bridging its gaps. At Point Salines, Rangers and paratroopers cleared wreckage, marked landing points, and built defenses, while signal soldiers improvised connections between radios that were not meant to work together. Sometimes reports and fire missions had to pass through several nets or aircraft overhead. Company leaders changed routes when roads were blocked or misplotted. Patrols adjusted when they found unlisted student housing or unexpected defenders. At isolated sites, small teams held under fire long enough for heavier support to arrive. Air and naval power, once tied into the ground fight, helped break organized resistance. By early 1980 standards, precision still carried risk, and later reviews studied painful near misses and errors. But when spotters could see the target, reach the guns, and correct the fire, positions on ridges and near barracks were smashed or shaken into surrender. The defenders' own limitations mattered too. Some Grenadian and Cuban personnel fought bravely, but they were not unified by a clear island-wide plan. Some surrendered when cut off, while others slipped away. That uneven resistance gave American commanders room to recover from early friction. It also made judgment harder for the troops on the ground, because one checkpoint might collapse quickly, while the next ridge or barracks fought with real determination. Soldiers and Marines had to move quickly without assuming the next contact would be easy. In the immediate aftermath, Operation Urgent Fury looked like a clear success to many Americans. The students were flown out, the coup leaders were swept aside, and a new government began to take shape with regional backing. Families saw their sons and daughters return home. Units took pride in what their soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen had done under pressure. Yet inside the military, the operation raised sharp questions. Reports of tourist maps, incompatible radios, delayed fire missions, and confused procedures made clear that victory had exposed uncomfortable truths. Those lessons helped drive a broader reform of joint warfare. In the following years, doctrine, training, and professional military education put more weight on interoperable communications, common maps, clearer command relationships, and realistic joint task force practice. Grenada became an example of the danger of assuming separate service systems would mesh automatically in the first hours of a crisis. Its success gave reformers political room, while its flaws gave them evidence. Today, Grenada remains a reminder that even small wars can expose large seams. Radios and maps can be as decisive as rifles and rockets, and bravery should be matched by the tools needed to make separate units work as one. For students of military history, veterans, planners, and classroom audiences, the fight offers both a story of courage and a warning about building the glue of joint warfare while the shooting has already begun. Headline Wednesday is developed by trackpads.com as part of Dispatch, U.S. Military History Magazine.